Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist depression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ at 102.1, your local community radio station. My name is Andy and I'll be with you for the next hour. Coming to you today from Durrumble Country in central Queensland, Capricorn Coast area, and acknowledging traditional owners everywhere. And on today's show, we are going to be talking about weapons and arms fairs. If you have been tuning into the Paradigm Shift recently, you would have heard a couple of weeks ago a show that we talked about the upcoming Land Forces Weapons Expo, which is happening at the Brisbane Convention Centre from October 4th to 6th, and Disrupt Land Forces, the gathering of peace activists and people who aren't keen on allowing some of the world's biggest merchants of death to gather together and all talk shop about their products they're selling to enable better and more efficient killing of people. Disrupt Land Forces is the opposite of that. It's people who want to stop it and getting together. And last year, of course, Land Forces was held in Brisbane for the first time in a decade almost, and there was a massive gathering put together, and it did a brilliant job at both bringing attention to what happens there inside the convention centre behind all the PR spin to talk about the use of these weapons, and also making it quite an unpleasant place to be for those hoping to do business deals there. Wasn't enough to stop it happening again, but that doesn't mean we're not going to try again to stop it. So if you want to listen to that previous show from 2 weeks ago, actually, I should mention this more often. On the 4ZZZ website, you can listen to previous shows. If you go to the Paradigm Shift page and then just swipe across the page or click on the little calendar icon backwards, then you will find that show where I interviewed Margie Pastorius from Disrupt Land Forces, as well as Michelle Fay, talking about the revolving door between weapons corporations, the military, and the government. So have listened to that. And this morning, actually, some of the crew from Disrupt Land Forces have been out on the road at Ipswich at the facility of Rheinmetall, one of the world's biggest weapons manufacturers, and one that notably sells tanks to and other weapons to the Indonesian military to enforce the occupation of West Papua and the repression of activists all through Indonesia. And they've been disrupting Rheinmetall, just warming up, I think, for Disrupt Land Forces. If you want to see what's going on there, head to the social media of Wage Peace and you will be able to see that. But stay tuned in for now to the Paradigm Shift, because today's show as well, we're going to be talking about weapons fairs, how to disrupt them, and why. I recorded a bunch of stuff last year, interviews in the lead up to Disrupt Land Forces, because I think it's a really important thing to do when it's right in the middle of our city, and when it's actually potentially quite a winnable campaign to stop this happening. And the reason I think that is because it has been done before. And so we're going to play an interview I recorded last year with Iain Mcintyre, one of Australia's great radical historians, about Aidex 91, which he did write a book about. It was a blockade of an arms fair in Canberra, and they managed to successfully stop the Aidex Weapons Expo from happening ever again. And so it's very interesting. It's a great bit of history, but also talking about the tactics and the strategy of it is very useful. And I like to do that on the paradigm shift. We're not just talking about the problems of the world here. We want to talk about how ordinary people like you and me can make a difference to make the world a bit better. So that's to come first up in the show. And then in the second half of the show, I'll talk to Elise West from the Medical Association for the Prevention of War about the work that they have been doing trying to stop weapons manufacturers infiltrating primary and secondary schools in Australia to try to get kids excited about, making weapons, and as well to try to funnel some of the gifted kids into their programs. And it's quite an insidious thing that the weapons industry has been doing, one of many insidious things that they do. And Mapwa there have been shining a light on and actually having some success as well. They've been managing to get some schools and learning institutions to back away from linking up with weapons manufacturers. So that's what's coming up. Stay tuned. I'll also have some great anti-war songs for you. And let's start off with learning a bit of history from Iain Mcintyre.
My name's Iain Mcintyre. I was somebody who attended Aidex 91, and I've helped document some stuff about the blockade since.
Yeah, so you did in fact write a book about Aidex and the blockade of it called Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. To start off with though, can you tell us what was Aidex?
Yeah, so Aidex was the Australian International Defence Exhibition, and this was, I guess, an arms fair that was being run in the late 80s and early 90s. It was a 2-year, happened every 2 years, and essentially it was brought together basically a whole bunch of weapons manufacturers and other people involved in selling weapons, and brought them together in the nation's capital out at what was known as the National Exhibition Centre back then, which was a big sort of conference centre. And yeah, basically hundreds of different companies would gather, and it was sort of their big powwow, and people would come from all over the world to check out the weapons they had for sale. And I guess it was held in the context of there was a push at the time from the then ALP government, federal government, they were kind of hoping that arms manufacturing would basically expand in Australia and become a bigger industry within Australia. So this particular kind of arms selling conference was kind of tied in with that. Now, the Australian arms industry didn't really grow in the way they expected, and a lot of that was down to international factors, basically with the end of the Soviet Union. There was, for a period, a whole lot of disarmament happening in the former Soviet Union, and so the world market for weapons was kind of flooded with all these former Soviet weapons, and so that made it very hard for the Australian companies to get in, as well as sort of there's a bunch of other factors to do with the manufacturing industry at the time. But certainly there was this push from the government to expand things.
Now, there was also a very strong resistance from Australian people to the Australian arms industry expanding, and the blockade of Aidex was a good example. And so your book is mostly about this mass blockade of this arms expo. Yeah,
so in 1989 there was a smaller protest outside of Aidex, but really that the organisers, sort of their intention, as sort of described in the book, and was that they wanted to kind of, they knew they didn't have enough time to kind of shut Aidex 89 down, but they figured by having a protest it would kind of put the event on the map, I guess, for the sort of Australian activist community. And then between 89 and 91, the people who organised the blockade travelled all over Australia, sort of trying to bring together this big network. And there was a bunch of other groups, peace groups and so forth, also doing the same thing. So that was quite effective in terms of mobilising people across a broad spectrum, sort of from Catholic justice activists and the Catholic Church through to the kind of far left and all sorts of people in between. Mm. And the organisers, so they sort of organised this blockade, but I suppose there were a couple of factors other than, the fact that they kind of reached out to such a big network and kind of in a way hyped Aidex 91 as, the place to be, that, we were really going to get these arms dealers. I think there was a few factors that helped them mobilise such a big group. You basically had the first Gulf War happen between the two arms conferences, and there was a lot of people protesting against the Gulf War, and that kind of put the issue of Australian militarism and the arms industry into people's minds. And also the first Gulf War was a big shift because Australia hadn't been involved in a conflict like that really since Vietnam. At the same time, forest blockades were happening in a big way, particularly Northeast Forest Alliance. So, and some of those, like Chalundai, have been quite successful. So there was sort of a group of people around the kind of forest scene. And I guess Aidex, the conference was sort of turned into a kind of a unifying symbol of kind of waste and greed and cruelty. And the blockade was very much pushed in that way. So it was sort of, whatever issue you're into, it ties into militarism and war and nationalism and arms dealing in some way. If you want to protect the environment, that ties in. If you're concerned about women's rights globally, that ties in. So all these different issues could be tied, and here's this target, all these hundreds, if not thousands, of arms dealers and military officers and all the world's worst governments and all the rest of it. They're all going to have representatives at this place. So it really made it a kind of focal point for people's protest activity.
So, 15 years after the Aidex conference, you wrote a book about it, obviously thinking that this history was important. Why was that? What's important about this history that should be remembered?
Well, yeah, quite a few things. I mean, essentially, the Aidex protest was successful in many ways, and therefore I thought it was worth looking back at what made it successful. At the time that I put the book together, it's basically an oral history, so it's a whole lot of different people's voices, and I tried to make it as sort of varied and representative of the different groups who were involved in the protest as possible. Around that time, there was going to be the first kind of open arms fair, basically since Aidex, happening in South Australia. So it just seemed like a good time to kind of revisit the protest. I guess on a personal level, because I'd taken part in the Aidex blockade, it was also, I was sort of interested in working through some of the things that I'd experienced there and so forth. So, I mean, in terms of being successful, what happened was the conference was meant to run, I guess, over 4 or 5 days, but I guess in terms of kind of counter-protest strategies, basically the police and the organisers of Aidex didn't expect expect people to turn up before the thing started. And people got there quite a bit before it started and started blockading days basically before the conference was meant to begin, and which meant that all the entry points to the exhibition centre were shut down, and that meant that basically the people running the conference couldn't get their pictures and tanks and whatever into the site. So the whole space was sort of shut down. Eventually there was, we don't really know exactly how many people were there because people came for sort of varying amounts of time, but at least I would say 1,000, upwards of 1,000 people blockading. The exhibitors couldn't get their stuff in. In the end, they brought in a whole bunch of police who kind of had to cut a hole in the fence to create their own gate, and they never got all of the exhibitions in, and some of the exhibitors didn't exhibit, and some of the people who were coming, the attendees, didn't bother turning up, because even though the police kind of were able to get people through the gates eventually, anybody who was attending was still facing like picket lines of people. And so once the exhibition opened, you basically had round-the-clock picketing, and that kind of took the form of, basically people lining up, blocking entrance, police often being lined up, things getting very hot, and then the police being given the order to basically smash through the picket, and then they would smash up the picket, and then, the picket would reform, and all of that would start over again. So the event was majorly disrupted. First of all, the coverage, it got, it became a major media story all around Australia, which sort of informed people that, hey, there's this growing arms industry, and there's these people who quite openly have an event every year where they celebrate what they do. Protesters were, generally maligned in the media. There was kind of crazy stories the police put out about, people throwing acid-filled condoms, as if you could have acid like in a condom and it wouldn't go all over your hands or whatever. But anyway, they ignored that logic. They found a spear gun in someone's car, so suddenly that became, the protesters were wielding spear guns, this sort of thing. But sort of oddly enough, that kind of negative publicity which made, as one of the Aidex organisers called the protesters thugs and terrorists, that kind of backfired because the ACT government had already said that they'd already said before Aidex 91 that they didn't want to have another one of these events. They didn't, they just didn't want to be involved. So because there was so much kind of negative publicity both about the protesters but about the event, the Aidex people, they tried to rename their conference Oztech, and they basically couldn't find anyone who was willing to take the event on because all the other states were it's going to cost us heaps in policing. We're going to get all these violent, crazy people coming here who weren't violent or crazy, but, that was the image that was projected. So pretty much Aidex 91 meant that there were no open arms fairs held in Australia again for quite some years. And then, we got to 2008 and they were trying it on again.
Which brings us to Land Forces, which is happening in Brisbane. How do you think that history influences how we should respond to this arms fair happening in Brisbane?
Yeah, well, I guess the context, is different now to 1991 as it was in 2008 when we managed to stop the arms fair in South Australia. But I think there's some basic sort of lessons come out of it. I think it's definitely worth putting up or proposing a blockade, and if that blockade or the threat of a blockade basically can make the people putting on the conference or the people who need to provide the policing and security in order to make the conference happen, if it can impress on them that the political and financial and other costs are too great, then you've got a chance of getting it called off. So in 2008, they were going to have this new open arms fair. So as I say, there have been meetings of arms dealers and manufacturers, but they sort of had to go back into the shadows after Aidex 91. So they were starting to come out of the shadows in 2008. And, so they were having this conference in South Australia, but because a new group, some of whom had been involved in Aidex 91, plus other people, basically pledged to have big blockade. And because it wasn't that long after the G20 protests in Melbourne, which, had seen quite a bit of chaos and sort of so forth, the South Australian government and the police sort of looked at it and they decided, and I don't know that they would have needed this many people, but they decided they would need at least, 500 or 600 police to make sure this event went ahead. And on the basis of that, they decided it was just too expensive. So they turned around and said to the organisers, you're going to have to come up with the money, and then the organisers were like, well, we can't afford to pay for those kind of policing costs. So in 2008, that's how we managed to stop that arms fair. So I guess there's a lesson there in terms of if a blockade can, there's certain events, I think, where the state or big business will pay whatever it takes to make them go ahead, but then there's other events where they won't, and thus far the history of arms fairs has been that they haven't been willing to kind of spend exorbitant amounts of money. I guess the other thing is that by having a protest or a blockade, I mean, it's very important just to, as with most protests and blockades, to try and let the world know what's happening and that this kind of thing is happening, and that a substantial number of people see it as unacceptable. And there's a whole lot of other things that blockades can achieve too.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian. And if people do want to read your book about Aidex, how can they do so?
Yeah, so if they go to commonslibrary.org, which is an activist resource repository, and they just type in Aidex, AIDEX, or if they type that in, then they'll find the book. There's also a radio documentary and a whole bunch of photos.
All right, thanks very much, Ian.
No worries.
On the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ, we are talking today on the show about trying to stop arms fairs and these places where the weapons industry get together to showcase some of their wares and try to scam money out of the government for them, because ultimately that's who buys weapons, is the government, and it's taxes money that could be paying for all kinds of other services that does go into the pockets of these weapons companies whose business is to work out how to kill people better. And that's, in a nutshell, that's what it's all about here. And that's why people are talking about trying to get down to the Brisbane Convention Centre at the start of next month to try to disrupt land forces. You can find more info. It's that name, disruptlandforces.org, or on social media to find out how to get involved. And we were hearing Iain Mcintyre talk about the Aidex blockade in 1991, incredibly successful campaign in Australian history. And it's so easy to forget this, when we're taught history at school or on the TV or whatever. We don't learn the history of how ordinary people got together and managed to stop a weapons conference, even though there was so much money behind and government behind these weapons expos. But it lingers in our movements, in some of the people who were there, some of whom will be at Disrupt Land Forces, people who are at Aidex, or people like Ian who've put the work in to document some of this history. And it's so valuable to know because It really enables us to believe that change is possible, and it gives us some idea of some of the tactics that are useful, and a lot of those tactics that were used at Aidex are things that people will similarly try to do at the start of October up here. And an inspiration for us to keep going, to write our own history and not leave it to the supposed important people, but to realize that all of us can be a part of shaping the world that we live in. So I've got another interview here that relates to land forces. I spoke with Elise West. She's from the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, which over the years has been quite a significant force in resisting militarism. And right now they've got a campaign going against the militarization of our schools, primary schools and secondary schools. And that may seem extreme, but of course there's always things like cadets and little things like that have been part of, I guess, the subtle indoctrination of kids from a young age into the importance of war and the weapons industry and everything that goes along with it. But what they're specifically talking about is weapons manufacturers trying to get their tentacles into schools to sponsor programs and to get kids linking up from a young age with the weapons industry, to get them excited about the possibilities of the money they can make and, of course, the cutting-edge technology toys they get to play with, and it's a drain of talent away from the real problems in our society about how to fix some of the social problems, how to fix climate change, and into the war racket. And so let's have a listen to Elise.
Hi, my name is Elise West. I'm the Executive Officer of Medical Association for Prevention of War.
So before we go any further, Elise, can you give us a bit of a background of who the Medical Association for Prevention of War are and what you do?
All right, so MAPW is a national network of health workers from every field. We're the affiliate of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, who were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985, and we're the founder of ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, who is the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Our work is based on the commitment of our members as health professionals to do no harm and to preserve the health and dignity of all people, but also on the recognition that many of the things that affect people's health are outside the biomedical model. We focus on peace because it's a fundamental enabler of human health and human flourishing. And by preventing war and the normalisation of war, we save lives and prevent illness and disability, displacement and trauma, as well as the terrible effects of war on the environment.
A very broad-scale approach to community health, I guess.
Correct. Yes, it's a really fundamental public health issue that without basic human security, we can't address the other things that we find important. Housing, education, good jobs, accepting societies, a healthy future are all based on the need for peace.
So one of the recent campaigns that MAPW has run has been about the influence of the weapons industry in schools in Australia. Can you tell us a bit about this?
All right, so the proliferation of weapons is one of the greatest threats to peace today, and the development and trade and use of armaments undermines human security and creates really serious harm. We're also particularly concerned with nuclear weapons. They pose a really grave existential threat. The weapons industry profits from war and insecurity, and it's very strongly associated with corruption and human rights violations. And when we see the weapons industry as just another industry and focus on things like job creation or fancy technology or the value of our exports, we really normalise and sanitise their core business, which is war and harm and insecurity. So our investigation into the influence in schools began in 2019 with research conducted by Lisa Coulthard. And we found that major weapons companies are seeking to build positive brand recognition amongst Australian students. We focus particularly on primary and secondary students, so kids as young as 4 and 5 in schools, with the intention of attracting best and brightest young people into a talent pipeline. So starting in primary school, through secondary school, into university and out to careers on the other side. And also with the intention of developing a workforce that's socialised to accept the development and use of war, hardware and software as essential and exciting careers. And of course, by extension, that war is inevitable and weapons are good. We also found that weapons companies' STEM programs, so that's science, technology, engineering and maths programs, promote and gamify skills that will be relevant to next generation weapons. So things like hypersonics and smart munitions, artificial intelligence and lethal autonomous systems. And these are all weapons that, well, the moral and legal implications are very profound and are yet to be settled. They're characterised by their potential harm to non-combatants and the distance they create from actual killing and the automation of life and death decisions. We think that this is really important and deserves more attention and more discussion amongst citizens and parents and teachers. We think that this is a social issue and also affects STEM education more generally, because shaping the STEM education ecosystem to meet defence skill needs, not other skill needs, is really an explicit goal of the government. And we think this starves other industries, say like renewable energy, for example, from really talented, committed young people who have been influenced very early on by an industry that we think is very harmful.
So can you give us an example of some of the STEM programs in schools that the weapons industry are involved with?
Yeah, so we found about 24 programs across Australia. We think there are probably many more, mostly funded by big industry primes like BAE and Boeing, Thales, Lockheed Martin. They're things like sponsorships, events, competitions, tours of industry premises, exhibitions at career fairs, things like direct engagement between company employees and student teachers, where company reps might go into classrooms. There are career pathways, so strong agreements between schools and local weapons companies to provide things like apprenticeships. We found Northrop Grumman, which is the third biggest weapons maker in the world, sponsors a trip to the United States for teachers and children. We're also really concerned by programs like First Lego League, which is open to children as young as 4 years old, and as the name suggests, involves using Lego. BAE Systems is one of the sponsors of that, and as you might know, BAE is associated with corruption and fraud, is involved with the manufacture of components for nuclear weapons. We think this is a really problematic association.
So there's a kind of cultural influence here in that from a very young age, kids are socialised into thinking about weapons as productive and exciting and an industry to be involved in. Is there a direct sort of link, I guess, in personnel, in like funneling these people into the weapons industry?
Yeah, look, so we've started looking into that. We've started looking at things like higher education theses, for example. So looking at when you have a very strong relationship with a weapons industry, what are the kind of higher degree research projects that emerge? But we've yet to really get a full picture of the whole sort of sphere of influence.
There was, a few years ago, a bit of a campaign in Australian universities against the influence of weapons manufacturers in universities, particularly Lockheed Martin was one. Do you see links between what you're seeing in schools and that university influence? Absolutely,
yes. So we focus on primary and secondary education to sort of demonstrate the continuum, and that the influence of universities is really only part of the picture, and we noted it starting so much earlier. So children as young as 4 and 5 and 6 years old. It's a bit akin to junk food marketing for kids. So if you think about junk food sponsorship of sport to children when they are still forming their ideas and their opinions about the world, they receive positive messages and have exciting experiences with a brand that hides the kind of unhealthy aspects of what it does. And that's very hard to dislodge as children grow up and get older.
So can you tell us a bit about MAPW's campaign against this and how you've been trying to counter this influence?
We have been engaging with state education unions. We think this is a core issue for educators as well as being not good generally for society. We think it does also undermine some core educational values. Most states have a policy where companies involved with gun manufacture or gun promotion can't have relationships with schools, but we see that companies that make big guns, missiles or other weapons can, and we think that's a problem. So we've been engaging directly with education unions and also with education ministers about the problems, the gaps in the policy. We've also been disrupting other sponsorship arrangements between weapons companies and charities, for example. And we've also recently partnered with Engineers Without Borders, who are a great organisation who work directly with engineers. We've developed some Influencer for Peace fellowships where we take ambitious and talented young engineers and try to provide them with another perspective on the influence of weapons industry over engineering and STEM education.
That is a really vital thing, isn't it? I think we've talked about a lot in the past about sort of the average person, you know, the way the army supplies this kind of adventure and purpose in life, but as well that kind of the cutting edge of society. You know, weapons industries sort of portray themselves as the cutting edge of technology, and it's very attractive to some of the most gifted sort of STEM students. But there is that other, try to change what does the cutting edge look like, you know, and things like, ending world hunger or renewable energy and things like that. It is important to change that kind of culture, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. And that's where we think as an organisation of health and medical workers, we play a role because we focus on harm and doing no harm, and to highlight the fact that the weapons industry is basically it's a very harmful industry, not just to people but also to the environment, and that talented young people are needed on the cutting edge of less harmful industries that can actually solve some of our most pressing collective problems.
It's an incredible waste of human potential, really, when you think about it, in a world with so many issues that need resolving.
Yeah, and we'll note that recently the Australian government announced its intention to create a space force in recognition of space as a contested domain. So, the domains for conflict actually keep getting bigger, not smaller, and that actually creates more opportunities for a bigger defence industry that is going to require more people with more skills to fulfil. So we think it's really urgent that we address this issue now.
Okay, so in a couple of weeks' time in Brisbane, there will be the Land Forces Weapons Expo. Some of the companies that you've mentioned, big arms manufacturers, will be there. Do you think it's important to do something to resist things like the Land Forces Weapons Expo?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's really important to be present, to be loud, and to provide another point of view. I did hear one of the exhibitors at the exhibition calling anyone who doubted the importance of the weapons industry as an extremist. So I think it's really important to show that people from all walks of life, including health professionals, who have a commitment to the health and dignity of all people, also oppose the weapons industry from a very fundamental position.
Okay, thanks very much, Elise.
Thanks, Andy.
You are listening to The Paradigm Shift, speaking with Elise West there from Medical Association for the Prevention of War about their campaign to get the arms industry out of our schools. And at the top of the show, if you missed it, I did talk to Iain Mcintyre, radical historian, about the blockade of the Aidex Weapons Expo in 1991, which actually stopped not only Aidex from happening, but any big public weapons expo from happening in Australia for a couple of decades after that. So it is possible. And the point of all this show, all this talking on the show, is not just to learn this stuff, it's because there is a weapons expo coming up in Brisbane at the start of next month, and Disrupt the Land Forces, the campaign to try to stop it, is running a full week of programs to get to know each other, plan out some strategy, and then to get down there and try to make sure that the arms industry can never get together in the middle of Brisbane again to sell their products of death and destruction. There's lots of reasons to try to resist the war machine. Environmentally, it's immensely destructive, as we've said. It's incredibly costs a lot of money and very wasteful. I think culturally it has very negative effects on this country, where our idea of our national identity is limited to these myths of battle, where the only thing it means to be proud of being Australian is that you could go and kill somebody else on a battlefield. Well, number one, that's not very much to be proud of, and number two, everybody does that. Every country fights wars. It's no great Australian myth. It's time to start telling other stories about who we are and what we can be. And of course, ultimately, we see when we are fighting in conflicts the way that our people who go to war are kind of poisoned by the atmosphere of war. And as we've seen in the investigation into war crimes committed by the Australian SAS in Afghanistan, there's an ongoing defamation case against one of our leading SAS soldiers, Ben Robert Smith, about what he did when he was put in a position of power in a war zone. And it's horrible stuff, and it's time to speak honestly about war and what it does. And of course, with another potential global conflict that could involve Australia against our main trade partner, it's time to rein in the craziness of these cowboys leading us to another war. That's all we have time from the Paradigm Shift this week. I'll be back next week, and hopefully I'll see you at Disrupt Land Forces in a month's time.